work around business in emerging markets, corporate governance, decision analytics, digital innovations, future of work, and of course, sustainability. We are also a signatory to the Principles for Responsible Management Education, which some of you may be familiar with, is a UN-supported initiative which was founded 15 years ago as a platform that aims to raise the profile of sustainability in business schools around the world. And increasingly, balancing economic and sustainability goals is very important, not just for organizations, but also for students who are likely to be responsible managers of tomorrow. So in that context, I'm delighted that we have this workshop today, and I'm delighted that you're able to join us. And I'm sure you will have an engaging conversation, and we have an impressive array of speakers, and I'm sure you will enjoy the next couple of hours. Before I go, I would like to acknowledge the help of a number of institutions and colleagues who've made this event possible. The Carbon Trust, of course, with whom we as a school are leading the initiative of this UK Forum for Supply Chain Sustainability. The East Midlands Chamber of Commerce, with whom we have engaged quite a bit in our quest to help regional businesses. We're also very grateful to the National Institute of Industrial Engineering, Mumbai in India, with whom we have collaborated and engaged quite a bit in terms of connecting with, and they've helped us with us connecting to industry in India. I'd also like to thank BT and RepRisk for their contributions to this workshop, and a special note of thanks to Professor Robert Klassen, who is a visiting professor at the School of Business and Economics, and thank you for joining us. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. We have a wonderful participation from close to 20 countries, and we have 350 participants, as Alok said. So it's very nice to have all of you here. And I'd like to end by thanking Alok for organizing this wonderful event. And I look forward to the next 90 minutes. Thank you.
So just to give some examples of, we have, BP's catastrophic events, Rana Plaza disaster, we have Volkswagen incidents, and these are some high profile risk events. But what I would like to draw your attention to is the events that's been happening, say, for example, in the UK. Very recently, for example, the BlackRock, who is the largest investment fund company, the CEO mentioned that they will stop investing in companies who present a high sustainability related risk. And undoubtedly, that's why World Economic Forum identified 4 of the top 5 risks to society, firms, and country as being sustainability related. So the point I'm trying to highlight here is that different country, different context, what is ESG risk, what is sustainability risk, and how it manifests, and how it impacts firm differently. And the example that I would like to present is Boohoo. For example, we live in Leicester County, and we have this Boohoo supplier exploitation events, which actually Boohoo denied. But despite the fact, Boohoo ended up losing more than 45% of their shareholders' wealth within a week of this incident. Or actually, the better to say, it's the incident reporting in media. In the last few weeks, we have been hearing, about Apple that's suspending their orders to Western plant in India. Similarly, in the case in China as well, a lot is happening, and it can actually, sustainability risk can harm firm, their brand reputation. They can make firms target of activists, reduce their profitability, destroy shareholders' wealth. But the problem here is that it's a very, very complex concept, and this is what we try to kind of unfold here. And to unfold that, we have Professor Robert Klassen. He is, of course, a visiting professor at Loughborough University, but he is also the professor of operations management and sustainability at Ivy Business School. I'm sure anybody who is researching about operations and sustainability surely aware of his contribution. But in addition to that, he's also the interim director of Center for Sustainable Building Sustainable Value at Ivy Business School. He's also the co-editor for IJOPM. And co-department editor for production and operations management. He held the similar positions with Journal of Operations Management in past. So without losing any time, I would like to pass it on to Rob to talk about the specific topic around, what is this concept all about? What are the current research happening, and what are the implications? Rob, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alok, for the kind introduction. I will just try to get my screen up here. Hopefully I'm not on mute at this point, but anyways, we'll see how far it goes. Please let me know if there's a problem with the technology. In fact, I think that's the biggest risk of this presentation today, is that the technology won't quite work for me, or I'll run too long. So we will try to manage both as we go forward. First of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to so many of you. I know you come from very different research backgrounds, very different companies, and in very different parts of the world. And so part of the challenge with sustainability risk is trying to sort of unpack exactly what that is. And so in just the next few minutes, I will try to at least take a stab at that. Certainly won't be complete in terms of what I can cover in this short period of time, but obviously open to questions as we move forward as well. Let me just start here with, first of all, I'd like to just kind of throw out a few quotes that are pretty common colloquialisms that you'll have seen in many different places. You may have used some of them yourselves. Sustainability risk, I know it when I see it. We're in a dicey situation. Throw caution to the wind. Take a calculated risk. Each one of these statements encapsulates one piece of what I would see as part of sustainability risk. Clearly, there's the element of perception if we think about seeing it. We think about probability when we look at sort of a dicey situation. Some managers, companies might throw, in fact, caution to the wind, thinking that they will have retired before anything happens. And then, of course, clearly some do take a calculated risk. That's much of what engineering is about. It's about figuring out the probability and then deciding where the right break point is that we're willing to take the risk. And so every time we take the wheel behind a car, we're in essence taking a calculated risk, given that we know there's probabilities of having an accident and so on. So ultimately, all of these statements do capture elements of sustainability risk. And so what I'd really like to do over the next few minutes together with you is just sort of unpack some of this. And in doing so, really think about what supports management's efforts as they try to deal with sustainability risk, and how they sort of work towards a firm, an organization, a stance, and a strategy that really sort of allows them to manage risks in an appropriate way. What I'd like to do is just cover over the first few minutes some key concepts. I will focus on one particular research study that has been underway for a number of months at this point in time with Alec. And then we'll close with some implications, at least in terms of where things might go for that. And in the complementary talks that will be coming over the next hour and a half, I think fill out some additional pieces of this. And so I think together we certainly provide a more complete picture. Let me begin with a very simple diagram. It's a diagram that probably resonates with most of you if you sort of unpack either your personal experience or how you think about it within a research context. If we think about sort of risk in general, and I'll focus it maybe slightly more narrowly to operational risk, where we look at the way processes, people, and systems are put together within an organization, often there are conditions that become apparent at some point in time, either through some sort of incident or event that occurs, and ultimately there's harm caused by that. And so the simple example, I started out the presentation, you and I getting behind the wheel of a car. We start out, the operational conditions are there that hopefully we'll get to our destination, but clearly things can happen along the way, ultimately leading to some sort of harm or damage. And the outcome from that obviously is some incident-related costs. And that's just sort of a simplistic picture. And it's really sort of based on at least the common understanding in the financial sector and so on. You'll notice the site at the bottom there. And this is really sort of one way of characterizing risk. Now, what do we worry about in this particular context? It's really probability and the severity of the outcome. And so often sort of boiled down to a mathematical analysis of some form or another. The challenge then becomes, well, what's different about sustainability risk? Why is it so different, or at least I would propose it's different? You may or may not agree, but as we sort of talk over the next hour and a half, I think it's important to sort of define why we look at it as being different. So let me briefly digress to a bit of an analogy here. If a tree were to fall on an uninhabited island, would there be a sound? Now, I'm sure if we had time to poll everybody, and I know some of you used to Zoom, we do these little instant polls. I'm not going to do that here just in the interest of time. But if we think about sort of how this particular statement goes, there's a lot of assumptions embedded in this. But let me give you the definitive answer, at least according to Scientific American. In 1884, this particular question came up in one of their issues. And really, it's sound is a vibration transmitted to our senses through the mechanism of the ear and only recognized at the nerve centers. The falling of the tree will produce vibration in the air. If there are no ears to hear, there will be no sound, at least according to Scientific American. And the reason I like this quote and this example is that it starts to sort of unpack why sustainability risk is so difficult to manage. We talk about here is some of the four, and this is just an illustrative list. It's certainly not exhaustive. Clearly, I can put lots of citations around each of these, but I haven't for purpose of this presentation. But you can think about here where at least four principles are different when we talk about sustainability risk. Generally, when we talk about ratcheting expectations among stakeholders. So for example, what we considered healthy practice 10 or 20 years ago with respect to pesticides, not necessarily the case now. In fact, in my local municipality here, we've essentially banned all insecticides and pesticides for use on lawns. And that's not uncommon. A number of other places have done that as well. But 20 years ago, perceptions were quite different about what levels of pesticides we were willing to expose ourselves to. Scope of the impact clearly is also quite different. It can be quite localized in the sense of water pollution potentially in well water and so on migrates a certain a distance, but not very far, relatively speaking. On the other hand, global warming, very large impact, large scale, very different approach in terms of thinking about how to manage risk. We think about saliency of some issues. Some are really important to me as a person located in a particular community here in London, Ontario. Other issues might be more important to you in your local community, or given your diet, or given your experience in terms of taking different types of approaches with managing, let's say, the pesticide example I just gave earlier. And so we end up with very different expectations around exactly the same issue, exactly the same objective risk that might be there. And then the last one, which unfortunately has played out in a whole range of different circumstances, is how do stakeholders actually respond when something happens, an incident. Now, it may be just newly emergent in the sense that it's an accident, pipeline leak or something like that, where it's clear what's going on, but still the stakeholder reactions can vary quite dramatically. Other environmental, social issues, though, tend to sort of develop over a long period of time. And again, the reactions to global warming are quite varied and quite different, and have only started to really gain a global attention in the last decade or so. And so we talk about sort of different reactions to those. So I think the key difference when we take that initial conceptualization of risk is that now we have to add on some additional elements here to talk about how not only there is the condition, the tree falling, but there's clearly you and I as stakeholders recognizing something going on. And it's not just you and I, it's obviously NGOs, it's government, public policy, other competitors in the industry and so on. And so ultimately this combines to create some challenges. And ultimately a stakeholder reaction occurs from that. And so simply to have the condition is not sufficient. It's an important issue, but it's multiplied or compounded with the stakeholder reaction that might occur from that after the recognition. And then the last piece that I'm going to illustrate here is really that there is a cumulative history that develops as well. So a pipeline incident that happens to occur with one firm only once in 20 years is treated differently than the firm who may have exactly the same incident, but had the same incident or similar the year before and the year before that. And so has a negative track record as they sort of develop their operating practices. And again, stakeholders build this into their reaction. They ultimately have a whole range of other factors I'd like to suggest as well. But clearly these, at least in part, illustrate the challenges of managing sustainability risk. If we then kind of carry my example of the pipeline forward a little bit, I'd like to kind of illustrate how this plays out just by way of example, and from there kind of shift to some broader research that's going on. If we think about, first of all, how one might consider just this issue of sustainability risk from a pipeline operator perspective. So not necessarily the drilling, not necessarily the upstream or the downstream operations, but just the simple transportation. We can think about who exactly are they involved with as suppliers. Clearly, each supplier carries individual levels of risk. The type of energy, so it could be natural gas, it could be crude oil, it could be a whole range of different materials moving through the pipeline. All of it impacts the risk that might be there. And of course, the operations, the way it's actually done, has an enormous role. The maintenance that's done, the direct emissions that might occur, the rupture that might happen, and so on. And so very different to transport natural gas versus oil versus even municipal water for that matter. And so each of these pipelines has very different risk profiles associated with that. But more importantly, how stakeholders will react to issues become even more salient for our discussion. The other issue is that there's often an industry spillover effect that many of you have observed, I'm sure, and some of you have done research on, where one actor, one particular firm struggles with one area, and suddenly there's a broad scale, higher level of scrutiny attached to all players in the industry. And so it really then becomes, behooves the other industry players to almost police the rest of the industry. And this was in fact some of the challenges around the chemical industry about 20, 25 years ago, when they came up with common practices that would try to raise the standards for the whole industry on a voluntary basis. Some success, some not so much. The other thing is, obviously, as we see these risks develop, it either encourages investment or deters investment in many industries too. And so even a firm is not an island unto itself within its industry. It ultimately has implications there as well. So if we start to map this out, and I'm just using, again, this to try to be illustrative of how the varying impacts happen, we're very good, I would suggest, as a field at looking at the left column, where in fact what we're trying to look at is the various sources of risk that could occur and try to work through a probability and severity type discussion related to that. Where we're less capable and less able to understand sometimes all of the implications is when we look at it on a stakeholder basis. And so I've illustrated here suppliers, yes, they care a lot about the inputs the firm chooses and how that might affect the risk relative to sustainability. But if you look at customers, probably the most concerned about disruptions due to spills or other things like that. We talk about the entire business model and the Keystone XL pipeline, very relevant to Canada. I'm aware it may not be that familiar to many of you around the world, but the large pipeline that had been planned down to the US has gone through multiple significant major regulatory hurdles to try to put that in place, and under the most recent US administration now is ultimately being canned again. And so there are enormous risks when we think about particular ways of operating and developing different business models. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, industry peers clearly care a lot as well about how this may play out in terms of suppliers and customers and so on. What I think we also have to add on to this is an incomplete list. There are lots of other stakeholders, and I've only highlighted two here in the interest of time, where the community is actually probably the most highly impacted if there's a problem. Now, pipelines extend hundreds of or even thousands of kilometers, and so you think about the community as really just one isolated, localized community. But clearly other related communities get very concerned the same thing could happen to them. And so ultimately community activists, community engaged individuals see a lot of risks associated with sustainability that you and I might argue mathematically aren't really that high in terms of the likelihood of it happening. NGOs, again, see this in a very different light, and ultimately that plays out in terms of the way they examine operations, the way they lobby industry peers to manage their operations as well. So you can think about here's two general approaches to risk. Both of these climbers may make it, but I certainly would prefer to be the climber on the right, where there is some safety net, well, sorry, not a safety net, but some rope that and other cabling that sort of helps in the case there is a fall. Now, the fall is ultimately the incident that would be horrific in this case for either climber, but which climber is more likely to survive if there's a problem? And firms, I do believe, take different approaches to managing this. Some hope for the best, and others try to actively put support systems in place to manage this. And the support systems don't just include what you do internally, but it also includes the community engagement, NGO engagement, and so on that extends far beyond the firm to manage all of the stakeholders that I had in the previous slide here. So if we think about how do we look at this, I'd like to now just zero in on one particular aspect in the few remaining minutes that I have here. First of all, I'd like to focus specifically just on how does management's long-term orientation really help or hinder or whatever, because it really is a proposition, the risk in terms of this. Does it help in terms of if management sort of thinks more than 3 to 5 years out, how do we sort of look at that? And it's a difficult question to answer. I'm certainly not the only one, and Alec and as co-author and so on are not the only ones to try to answer this. And I should mention we do have a third co-author as well, Nuri Najjar, who is also at Ivy. And so we undertook this study to try to look at whether a longer-term orientation may in fact provide some cushioning or otherwise benefits in terms of sustainability risk. So what I'm going to do in the next few remaining minutes is kind of unpack how did we think about this given the earlier discussion I had about sustainability risk, then talk a little bit about what the actual findings were and a few implications that we see from that. So if I go back to the diagram here, lots of pieces to this diagram, and it's difficult to sort of turn around and say, how can we unpack this? But let me try, just let me try in the few minutes here. So we've got here really sort of management's time horizons. What we're proposing is affecting this broad construct of sustainability risk. And of course, sustainability risk actually can be further defined as environmental, social, or governance risk. And all three of them, at least under much of our current thinking, kind of fits together into a complex picture of what sustainability risk is. And so we take this as kind of the starting point. How does management's time horizon affect that? And then the argument is really that by management looking farther out, they can put those systems, processes, people training, other sorts of technologies in place that really allows the firm to do a better job of managing the risk. So if, first of all, an incident might be less likely to happen. If it happens, it's less severe. If a less severe accident happens, as well through both the relationships with communities, through investments in processes and technology over time, ultimately the firm is able to manage it much more effectively if something does in fact occur. So collectively, there's much talk about whether a longer-term time horizon will in fact have a positive impact on managing sustainability risk. In other words, reduce the risk. And in the counterpoint is obviously a short-term perspective, where in fact management really focuses on managing earnings, managing investments, managing financial outcomes around what happens over the next year or two at most. And there's a number of studies that have already explored this longer term time horizon versus short termism in a number of other fields in terms of how that might play out. And so I'm not going to go into all of those studies, but focus more specifically just on where we ended up for this particular one. Now, when we think about management time horizon, there's actually multiple ways to think about this. And so the core question is, does the long-term time horizon reduce risk? Now, if we think about one signal that has been sort of developed in the literature, is to think about what does management say in terms of how they think about time. Do they talk a lot about short-term outcomes, quarterly earnings, annual results, immediate competitive moves, or do they talk more about the longer-term actions that they might take? And if so, what does that look like? And so a number of researchers have used this approach to look at temporal orientation or time horizon thinking within management. I'm actually not going to use that one. I'm actually going to turn to the second one here, which is how do we look at how management acts? And of course, you'd think the two are quite well aligned, and so that is one issue. Does management always walk the way they talk or not? But in large part, what we're focused on here is more on the behavioral part. And so several different measures have been proposed in the literature to consider how one might think about long-term time horizon. And generally, when we think from an operations lens, it comes across in two different ways. The first way is really thinking through the products and the way they sort of develop markets, because obviously operations, either through their supply chain or through their internal operations, has a key role in that. And so one classic measure is really to think about R&D investment. If you're investing for the long term, clearly you're going to be putting more into product development as you sort of look forward in that. Second piece, second dimension, and the two actually aren't correlated very highly, so let me note that as well, is that there's an investment as well in plant process and equipment, or sorry, plant property and equipment, where we talk about now from the second major dimension of operations, what are we doing internally in terms of sort of managing how we run our operations? And again, the thinking is here as you invest in new processes, first of all, it's likely to also have some positive either environmental or social implications. The processes will be safer. The processes are also likely to have lower emissions, probably be more energy efficient. None of these are necessary outcomes, but usually management is trying to sort of think a little more broadly about that. And so we have multiple aspects in terms of how we look at this long-term orientation, product versus process. And both of them definitely at least point towards a longer term orientation, but different dimensions, different aspects. The second piece of the study then is really to think about, well, how do we look at the sustainability risk, the way it actually comes out or the way it actually occurs within a competitive context or from a firm. And so here there are a number of different databases that one could use. We happen to sort of identify rep risk as an approach forward on this. And so rep risk, the advantage of that is really that, and we'll have another speaker unpack more details about that. So fortunately, I don't have to do that in this talk. But if we sort of think about it in its core, what it's trying to do is capture actual stakeholder recognition and reaction. The condition, unfortunately, may have been there for many years as a latent condition that simply wasn't recognized. But from our perspective, what really matters for the firm is the recognition. And partly that's because of these ratcheting standards. So you can argue, could management have foreseen a risk 20 years ago when they came out with a particular product or process or approach to managing their business model? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But in many cases, no. And in fact, we would argue, well, yes, that may have been a latent risk, but nobody recognized it as a latent risk. And so it's very hard to sort of work through that. However, when it becomes recognized by stakeholders in the present day, clearly how the firm manages the risk is extremely important. And the track record they develop around managing that risk is extremely important and so on. So ultimately, this creates some challenges. And this is the part that we're focusing on, is when stakeholders react, how do they react in terms of the severity of the incident, in terms of the scope of the incident, and then in terms of the reach, which is really about how broadly is the incident captured within the media and so on. And again, let me just suffice it to say there's these multiple dimensions that get packed into this particular database. So if we think about sort of the study that we've developed here is really sort of looking at the key variables are R&D intensity and as well this investment orientation. And really it's looking at how long are the assets generally going to be in place. That's the measure, again, accepted within the literature here. And so none of these measures are particular to us, but really relying on the work of many others. Sustainability risk, the rep risk, has not been widely used in academic studies, but we do believe it has lots of potential. Focuses on, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the reaction. It also captures the frequency because it does look at cumulative occurrences over a period of time as well within the database. And so there's a range of different measures that get embedded in the index. And I should note also that a firm that had an incident in 2012, there is a period of time that will occur before the incident goes away in terms of the index, but it does go to zero. So it's not as though having one incident just accumulates within the firm's rating system. And so that's good for us as researchers because, in fact, at some point you'd think management has put in additional systems in place, additional safety harnesses or ropes or whatever from my mountaineering analogy there. And in doing so, incidents should be less likely to happen in the future. We do have a number of control variables, classic sort of list that you would have seen in many other studies like this. And so we look at firm size and past performance, debt ratio, capital base, a whole bunch of other things like that. We looked at a 10-year period. There's about 6,400 different observations representing almost 650 firms in the database that we use. So we focused on US manufacturing. I put up the mathematical equation here, not going to dwell on it, but in essence, an econometric model is what we used using the panel data that was available. And ultimately what this allowed us to do was separate out the product, the R&D, the process, which is the firm investment horizon here in terms of the process side of things, and then the interaction term, which really allows us to, in part, see whether there's some synergy between these two as well. And then we used a variety of fixed effects as well as a number of robustness checks. All right, so let me skip then to the key findings, just I'm watching the clock here, just in the interest of time. And so what I'd like to focus on here is just the very high level findings. And happy to answer questions or unpack further if that would be of interest to individuals. If we think about here, first of all, we did find the longer term horizon definitely did reduce risk. And so I've got kind of two ways of looking at it. I've got sort of, here's some quantitative assessment of that. First of all, higher R&D intensity did in fact lower the risk. We also had the longer investment horizon lowering risk. So actually both factors, and remember those two aren't highly correlated, ultimately did impact each individually positively. And so you see the numbers there. As you increase the R&D intensity, you do see risk falling by a substantial percentage. And the same thing for the firm investment horizon. Now, we have the graph on the side there that kind of shows on the right-hand side, that kind of shows the interaction between the two. Clearly, they're additive, but they become much more reinforcing as they move towards the longer-term time horizon there. And so there, in fact, is a lot of intensity. And I should say that the average firm was about 6% R&D intensity. So if you're thinking about how do you do relative to others, above 6% would certainly be viewed as longer term. And the same thing on the lower. Now, we do have industry controls and so on, so there is some control for that within. But just across the whole database, same thing for firm investment horizon. The average sort of ratio of investment to depreciation was about a 13-year horizon. And so, again, you can use that as a comparison point for your own industry and so on. But again, we did normalize, and there's lots of variance across industry. The next step really then is to further step forward in my earlier talk about thinking about how different stakeholder groups might affect sustainability risk. And really, this is kind of the direction we're taking this. I think there's a lot of promise in terms of unpacking how different stakeholders individually affect this risk. Is it really about thinking through how we respond to customers? I think that's what most firms naturally gravitate towards. But indirectly, or maybe directly, working with NGOs and community groups can be absolutely fundamental to how one manages risk. And trying to find particular data and quantitative analysis around this, I think, can really open up some new avenues for inquiry, as well as, just as importantly, new avenues for practice in terms of how we might move this forward. If you're a manager or a senior manager in a firm, let me just sort of close with three questions that we at least see arising from some of this work and continuing on in this area. First of all, if you think about your business model, it doesn't matter. I've used obviously a number from all the way from pipelines to different products and insecticides and so on. Obviously, it's going to affect your particular industry in a different way, but actually sort of mapping out who are the key stakeholders, how exactly it impacts across different either suppliers or customers ultimately matter as well. And so there's been an enormous amount of tension, at least in the apparel industry, as Alec mentioned in his opening example, to start to map some of these supply chains down to the second or even third tier. And in doing so, really sort of think about the business model they have. Does it make more sense to become more vertically integrated, for example? Not popular with necessarily some of the investment community, but there is value from a risk perspective in terms of managing towards more vertically integrated, at least with strategic suppliers. If we then think about sustainability risk for different stakeholders, who are the key stakeholders for your particular firm, and how do they actually influence or impact the systems that you have in place, whether it's people, whether it's processes, or whether it's other broader systems that integrate the technology that you're using in your organization? The last one, which is probably the more difficult to answer, but at least we have two quantitative measures, is looking at how you do at two dimensions, R&D as well as investment in plant property and equipment, when we think about the ways of characterizing long-term versus short-term orientation. And again, these do need to be assessed relative to your industry, but it gives you a sense of where do you line up on the spectrum and what are the likely implications as you look forward to doing that. And with that, I will close and turn it back to Alec here as well.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rob. That's very fascinating presentation. I'm sure there's a lot to take from here, particularly understanding what are the key components of sustainability risk and how it could be measured and its implications, including some of the antecedents which has not yet been explored, particularly in this context. You talked about long-term temporal orientation. We move on to our next presentation. We have another speaker from industry, Tony Roy. Tony heads the sustainability and governance at PT Procurement Group. And just to mention about BT has consistently been ranked as one of the topmost in the UK when it comes to the sustainability practices. And I was following, and there has been some award yesterday as well, but I'm not really sure what that award was. But just to talk about BT, to give the context, BT pretty much manages like more than 12,000 suppliers with 6,000 plus suppliers as their strategic partners. They have close to 14 billion spent on their suppliers. And those suppliers are in multiple countries. And Tony play a key role in managing the supplier sustainability auditing governance within the procurement group. He specifically specialized and focused on ethical and environmental improvements, particularly for the BT supplier of goods and services. And in particular, in the context of UK, where we have Modern Slavery Act, uh, Tony also runs BT's Modern Slavery Act due diligence with high-risk suppliers. And last but not the least, he manages BT's award-winning Better Future Supplier Forum. So we are really looking forward to the context of BT and what is sustainability risk for BT, how they identify it, and how they manage it. Tony, over to you.
Thank you. And I'm hoping you can see my screen.
At least I can, yes.
Okay, good. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure, and thank you for inviting me, Alok. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about these various things. What's the context and of sustainability risk? How do we define ESG and sustainability risk? So how do you identify those suppliers? How do you work with them in life? And I'll probably leave you with a couple of case studies that we've done, which has helped us, and really, go into that in a bit more detail. I'm hoping I'm going to have some time at the end for Q&A. So do let me know. So to start with, as Alok explained, a very complex supply chain across the world. And for those who don't know about BT, we are the UK's biggest provider of telecom services, which includes both fixed line and broadband, and mobile technology, as well as BT TV and BT Sport that we have, and all the equipment to drive this comes from across the world. So as Alok's quite rightly said, we've got about 13,000 suppliers, and we need to keep a very close eye on them for various reasons, which I'm going to go into. So in our, I don't get too hung up on definitions, call it what you will, ESG, responsible sourcing, but these are some of the key components on the left, like ethical sourcing, climate change, we're now including diversity, inclusion, and the social impact as well. But, whatever you call it, what are we after? We're after, protection of our brand, and our company reputation, because even the smallest these days, it's ever so easy for someone to, put a tweet or a Facebook post or something like that, maligning the company, and it takes it takes a long time to get over that kind of thing, but we also after innovation and improvement with our supply chain, and see, BT, we are 150 years old. And obviously, we want to be around for some time. And the only way you're going to get ahead is by living your values. And BT has always been known to be a responsible company. So obviously, we want our suppliers to be responsible as well. And that's what we aim for throughout our engagements with suppliers. So one of the key elements is, of course, sustainability. And we started our journey quite early. Setting our first carbon reduction target, or you could say your first science-based target back in '92. Alok mentioned the Better Future Supplier Forum, which was set up in 2012, and we worked with a small group of suppliers, but then helped them improve and use those learnings to go bigger and wider to our supply chain, the rest of our supply chain as well. And the other, we were the first telco to launch our science-based target back in 2017, and a net zero target for 2045. So we've always been ahead of the game. What Alok mentioned just now was the award, which was really about carbon reduction. and that's something we're extremely proud of, and we work with the Carbon Trust, who unfortunately couldn't be there today, but also there's something called CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. It's a non-profit organization which benchmarks close to 10,000 companies globally on how well they're doing on carbon reduction, not only ranking them, but also how they work with their supply chains. And the award that we got yesterday was to be on the CDP Supplier Engagement Leaderboard. And only 7% of all the companies actually get on the leaderboard. BT have been on it for the last 5 years, ever since it started. So I'm especially proud of that. So this is one of our targets, and just to show you, just building on what I just said about the net zero targets, is a 3-to-1 target, which we've actually hit now. But what it's saying is that we committed to saving 3 times, saving our customers 3 times the carbon that we consume ourselves. So now, if you look at the smaller circle on the right-hand side, that shows what our own carbon emissions are made up of. Now, you might be wondering why our own footprint is so small. It's only 7%. Well, there's a reason for that. And people in the UK, you may or may not know this, but BT consume 1% of the UK's electricity, but 100% of that comes from renewable sources. So that's why our own footprint is so small. So, which means that the supply chain footprint, which is like more than 2/3, is so important. And that's why everything we do, our suppliers have to come on the journey with us. And so, as you can see, our target is to reduce our supply chain emissions by 42% by 2030. So how are we going to do this? We've got a number of things which you can see on the right-hand side. So we're targeting 500 of our suppliers to report to CDP. Then we're getting our 300 top suppliers to set net zero targets, just like we've done ourselves. Now, these may seem not very ambitious, but to be honest, even little things like this can move the needle a long way. For a fact that when a supplier reports to CDP, they get a ranking from A to E. So and usually suppliers end up at, when the first time they report, they're a C or a D. Now, no CEO wants to be there, right? They all want to be A or B. So that in itself, by influencing our supply chain, that helps them start reducing their carbon footprint. And setting a net zero target obviously is going to push you on that journey. What we've done is the deal that we get from our supplier for renewable energy in the UK, we're helping 99 of our suppliers. In fact, it'll probably be more. We've extended the deal to them. So that, if you imagine you're a small or medium-sized supplier, you don't have that kind of expertise or that knowledge on how to reduce your carbon footprint. Here's an easy way of doing it by using renewable energy, and BT is going to give it to you. So these are things that we help them do. And the other thing that we've done a few years ago, which won us several awards, was actually to add a clause to our contracts, to our supply contracts, to ensure that through the lifetime of the contract, the supplier is going to reduce carbon and demonstrate it. So all these things are going to help us get to our net zero target. And the reason, again, bringing it back to risk, if a supplier is ethically and environmentally responsible, or we as a customer can help them get there, that automatically reduces the risk for BT. So why do we work with them? So one is to understand what the risk is in the first place, and when we do that, and I'll take you through our end-to-end chain, our end-to-end process in a minute. We try and do that to take very prompt to understand what the risk is and mitigate that as soon as possible. So any new suppliers, we want to make sure that they're ethically and environmentally responsible. So we put them through a number of, either questionnaires or due diligence. Alok also mentioned the Modern Slavery Act. It's not about just making the statement, it's what you do behind it. And what we've been doing lately is going deeper down our supply chain into tier 2 and 3. And the other thing is, at the start of the journey, you want to make sure that your supplier is complying with your standards, which they are they usually demonstrate. But if it's a 3-4 year contract, do you actually know what's happened since you first signed the contract 3 years ago? You want to make sure that your suppliers are still responsible. Um, and the world is changing all the time. There's new legislation always coming in, and you want to make sure that you're always on the front foot here. So this is, it's a very simple end-to-end process. It starts with the procurement opportunity, which someone in the business brings to us. We prepare the plan, go to the market, negotiate and reach a deal. Then you award the contract, and then you have in-life management. But what we do is we have checks built in at every stage to make sure that pre-contract we choose the right suppliers and make sure that they abide by our rules. But post-contract, even more important, which we set up a couple of years ago, was the Third-Party Risk and Control Center, the TPRCC. And I'll come to them in a minute. That's really our nerve center for managing in-life risks. And there are many risks that we manage through them. And so this is how, so we've got 8 key risks, which you can see in the middle. Some of them are like climate change, human rights. There's also things like data privacy and health and safety and so on. Now, we've got 35, our 14 billion can be split up into different categories of spend. So most procurement professionals will be familiar with categories. So you can see some of those on the side. What we did was we had a very, very detailed workshop. It took us several days actually with the category teams and all that. And what we did was we mapped these categories against different risks, because one size does not fit all. So if you, for instance, a supplier of say network equipment or devices which are made in China primarily are more prone to human rights risks than say an info security risk. So when we did that model, we actually put each category in a segment, either gold, silver, or bronze, and the suppliers under them automatically went into those segments. So quite a big exercise, but it was really worthwhile. So what happens is when a buyer goes in, or say a buyer of info security, he knows which of his suppliers are silver or gold for that matter. So we've got that chart. It's an online these days, and at any given time you can see exactly for each category which of his suppliers fall into which bucket. But that's not that important, because that the in-life part is being monitored by the TPRCC. Now, there's a couple of things they do. One is all these suppliers are managed using an AI type system called risk methods, and that engine is constantly monitoring the media for any adverse media against each of those 6,000 suppliers. So any given time, if a supplier pops up, the risk methods team, they actually triage it. They look for they cut out any noise or something like that, and then bring it to the buyer to say, like, for instance, your supplier has been mentioned for human rights abuse or something like that, and or a data breach. So what are you going to do about it? So that, imagine that this is up to the minute. So the buyer would get informed no more than 24 hours after something has happened or been reported. So the buyer takes very prompt action, and along with, we have lots of subject matter experts across BT, and then and fixes those. So this has been a real great help for us, because risk methods, that the tool is actually on every buyer's desktop now. So at any given point, if when he opens his desktop in the morning, he'll see flashing risks, a world map with the risks and all his suppliers mapped out, so he knows exactly which one is at or is presenting a risk, so that they can take action. So it's really bringing the power of risk to all the buyers. So it's not just one person's problem, the TPRCC is still there to advise and help, but the buyer's fully involved and informed. What we also do is
5 minutes, please.
So we constantly monitor suppliers as well on different risks, and you can see the scorecard here. Now, the example here that I'm showing is really that, we work with suppliers to help them improve. So this is not meant to be a compliance tool. It's more of to help them get better at what they're doing. So, and that's the approach that we've always been taking. And, using our influence, that's actually helped us reduce risk quite a lot. So very typically, we've seen increased savings and competitiveness from our suppliers. Risk has reduced, especially in China, where we've worked with a lot of suppliers. It's taken us a lot of time, etc., to convince them that being ethically and environmentally responsible is something important. And we are not the only ones asking that. So, but we can use our influence to help them be better. So. Before I go into Q&A, what I'll do is I'll just give you a brief example because I'm conscious of time as well. One of the examples that I want to say is that when we during our due diligence, when we look at suppliers, we don't call them audits, we call them assessments, because and I'm an auditor myself, and what I say to a supplier is, look, we're going to come in, have a look at your systems and your processes, and for sure we'll find something. But the point isn't to penalize you. The point is, what we want to do is help you improve. And that serves for a much better long-lived and long-term relationship as well. So typically what we found once a supplier of battery parts was in Taiwan, and the auditor that went in found that that company had a lot of Vietnamese workers. And when they interviewed the workers, they found that the company had actually taken away their passports, and when we asked the management, they said, well, it's for their safekeeping so that they don't lose the passport. But really, that's it almost indicated some sort of modern slavery, because you were you're withholding passports is never a good thing, because it almost enforces power, in some ways. What we did was we insisted that they return these passports or gave workers access to those lockers where they were held. And that actually helped improve the situation quite a bit. There are numerous examples where we've seen workers working overtime, for instance, but overtime in China is quite a common thing, but there's a fine line between them being them doing it voluntarily and being forced to do it. So what we do is we work with we're members of the Responsible Business Alliance and the RBA, and with them we enforce a code of conduct with our suppliers. So all this actually helps us reduce risk in both in the supply chain, in sustainability, ethical sourcing, as well as diversity, inclusion, and so on. So I think I'll stop there because I'm out of time, or nearly there. So back to you, Alok.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tony. That's just on time. So thank you very much for a very fascinating presentation, and also talking about what BT is doing to work with their suppliers, how they identify risk, the kind of risk mitigation strategy that they have in place, and the kind of system they use for identifying those risks. And from there, we'll move on to another fantastic, fascinating presentation, because that, I think, identifying those risks is one of those crucial elements. I would like to present to you Dr. Heiko Behler, who is the head of ESG quantitative investment at RepRisk. It's an ESG data science and quantitative solution company. But just to give you a little bit of background of Heiko, he's a PhD in applied statistics from the University of Washington in Seattle. But prior to joining, he's also new to RepRisk in the last few months. But prior to joining RepRisk, he was the co-founder of the Swiss fintech Smart Stamp company. He was also the CIO at Swiss Trust Advisor, and before that, he was also head of quantitative solution at Credit Suisse. Again, previous to that, he worked on many leadership roles, including director at ABN AMRO, Deutsche Bank, and he worked in many countries, including New York, Tokyo, and London. So with that introduction, I would like to pass on to Heiko Behler from RepRisk.
Thank you, dear participants, and for attending this exciting workshop. My gratitude also extends to Alok and his team for inviting RepRisk, and also to my fellow panelists, especially, of course, to Robert, who was introducing RepRisk already as a valuable data provider. Thank you. That was great. Yeah, actually, Bob Eccles, one of the founding chairs from SASB, he always said to me, "Yeah, Heiko, you're actually joining the ESG space now to redeem yourself as a former hedge fund guy." It's true, but I'm very really enjoying it. Actually, I spent already more than a year now with RepRisk, and we developed a lot within RepRisk. So just before I now jump in, I would like you to know this presentation will also be made available after the workshop. So there's no rush if I skip some of the slides here. So RepRisk is indeed a global leader and pioneer in ESG data science. We started in '98 when UBS came to us and said, "You guys, we need some help to get some outside view on our clients when we onboard them." So we started, okay, we can do some screening of the internet and some databases and so, and that actually devolved in a really systematic approach. And in 2006, we launched that on the RepRisk platform as a due diligence tool to identify, assess, and monitor ESG risks in business relationship, operations, and investments. And really, since 2006, we have been doing that job in a very consistent way and really have not changed much of our research. We added only, and we grew this in an amazing product. So today, we really run the world's largest and most comprehensive database on ESG risks. We serve over 350 clients globally. So RepRisk is really also the only research data provider to systematically cover emerging and frontier markets, private companies, and infrastructure projects. And I'll tell you why in a moment. So our client base is quite large, 60 plus the world's largest banks, the top of the investment managers, sovereign wealth funds, sustainability index providers, but also UNC agencies. They use our data, and I really want to mention that SASB standard to a very big part is using our data for their research and the framework. Now, the first question that I was asked to talk about is, why is it important to understand ESG risk? And here we see that ESG risk incidents can have material impact on a company's bottom line. We see that in three parts, so in the ES and an G part. So like pollution could force companies to pay a lot of money for filters, make sure their waste cannot be deposed anymore in the rivers, and so forth. Climate changes, there are now targets to think of. On the social side, human rights abuses are all of a sudden reported, and one has to change the processes internally. There are labor laws now. We have to make sure we don't discriminate. We have to have a certain amount of women on the board. On the governance side, corruption is more scrutinized. Bribery is not a good thing to do anymore. We have these all these laws coming up. So we're really looking here at the compliance perspective, the reputational perspective, the financial risk. Currently, that is to some part already in the financial disclosure standards regulated. So this one materiality direction of environment on financials on the companies, that's one materiality, and we also have to think about another materiality, of course, and that is the materiality that the company's behavior has on our world. So these double materialities we will see in not so distant future will definitely be part of shaping the accounting standards, the regulatory environments, the EU taxonomies, and so forth. And that will be an exciting step when ESG will start not to integrate into the processes, but when the investment processes and the accounting processes start really to have a major impact on ESG and how this is managed. Now, how does RepRisk use data science to identify and measure ESG risk? As I said before, we're really looking from the outside. So RepRisk does not care at all what a company says about itself. RepRisk only cares what the world says about the company. So we're looking at more than 100,000 public sources on a daily basis. That could be like 25,000 NGOs, regional government reports, legal databases, but also the CNBCs, the Bloombergs, and so forth. And we do that in 20 major languages. And I'll show you a map briefly what we cover. It's mainly almost all the native language. So we have hardly any gray spots there. That translates roughly to 500,000 daily documents. Obviously too many to read manually. So we use in the first order AI algorithms that screen for our ESG research scope. Those are 28 issues, ESG issues, and 67 topics, which evolve over time. I'll show them to you in a moment as well. Cuts down the 500,000 to about 150,000. Then we use our machine learning algorithms, natural language processing, all the funky stuff that we used to call advanced statistics when I studied my PhD. Now we call them AI, machine learning. And that cuts down the daily flow to maybe 1,000 to 1,500 documents. And those are actually physically read by our 90 plus analysts. The analysts, they screen for issues. They look at what has been violated in the first order. And in the next step only, they look at what company is associated. Yeah. So once we see the company association, we then look at what company is that company already in the database, or do we need to add that company to the database? So in that sense, our database grows by 30 to 50 companies a day. And so this is our language coverage here. So you see we have hardly any blind spots anymore. But obviously where you see gray, English or some of the other major languages are a major contributor. So the word coverage, that's what I'm trying to get also here, is we really don't have a coverage because we cover everything. Anything that is coming up in any context of that has at least a major threshold of a violation will then be added to our database. And therefore now we're covering more than 160,000 companies. The main part obviously is private companies, more than 40,000 infrastructure projects, 34 sectors in all countries. It's a huge due diligence engine, really. Huh? So what are ESG risk categories and what is covered under the broader ESG domain? That means, how do we come up with our research scope of E, S, and G? And that doesn't come out of air, and there's also no script for that. And it's still also somewhat between infant and maybe teenage. So there are many different standards and regulations now, and it's coming more and more. And there's a lot of discussions, which directions will things go. In some regions do different steps than other regions. But essentially out of this sort of the mosaic of different conventions and regulations, and partially we're shaping those regulations like or conventions like SASB, we shape then our research scope. And our research scope is here. It's 28 ESG issues. So we have the environmental component, the social, and the governance component. You can see that social to a very, very large part actually is really labor focused. Then we look at 67 topics, which are a bit dynamic. So as our clients demand or the time demands, we're adding. So we have, last year we added epidemics and pandemics, for instance. And we also added racism and racial inequality and wastewater and management, as we saw them really as a sort of the hot topics. Yeah, that's our research scope. So now, where are we different to other ESG rating providers that tend to be based more on self-disclosed data, and maybe even some people criticize them for being subject to greenwashing? If I put this next to each other, this is sort of those are the three data camps that we identify. Again, RepRisk focuses on risk, on the outside analysis. We look at how companies behave, not what they say. There are daily updates. We look at listed companies, non-listed, emerging frontier markets, everything, project data, 20 languages, and we have a long history that's fairly consistent. Then we have the analyst-driven ESG research providers, as I mentioned. It could be MSCI, ESG, Sustainalytics, owned by Morningstar. It's valuable research that they do. However, it's focused in a bit of they focus on a different angle. They look at the company and the information that the company provides in their quarterly or annual filings. They look at what the company produces. So there's some kind of a product exclusion a little bit there. is sin products are downgraded, for instance. And then they look at the structure of those companies internally, like how many women are on the board, do they have sustainability departments, and also the focus is more on sort of in the listed space because it's manually very labor intensive. And so in the private and emerging frontier markets, there's hardly any coverage. And the focus is really mainly English. And then you have the third camp, which is a bit a part of what we do. But it's the only AI-driven research providers. It's mainly focused on primary listed company, and a lot of the data that they provide is more like startups out of Silicon Valley now, and a lot of the data can sort of be back engineered. So RepRisk we see as really the data provider in that space, looking at the conduct of the companies. That is sort of unique and the most comprehensive one. RepRisk also plays a big role in supply chains, and we see that as a daily updated ESG risk assessment and monitoring tool. As you can see, if you cover essentially all companies, you also covering all suppliers. The question only is how small is the supplier to be underneath the radar of any news sources that we cover, at least. But I think our coverage is with 100,000 something sources is very comprehensive. So leverage is something what RepRisk provides in terms of daily updated data in the supply chain. We try to give our clients a way to reduce sort of blind spots and identify a reputational risk really early on. So the idea here is if you have your suppliers mapped to your company that you're covering, you can then rate your suppliers or monitor them on a daily basis. You can separate them in risky suppliers and less risky suppliers. And from a reputational perspective, you can focus on more the risky part. And you can engage with them. And as my previous speaker says, you can start auditing them. And since he said that so clearly, or assess them, right? So that's is a tool that we provide either to our data feeds or our risk platform. But sometimes when you have a lot of suppliers, the data feed is quite convenient because it updates on a daily basis and gives you warning flags. I just want to give a small example here. We had just in fall, Apple was suspending one of its iPhone assemblers, Packatron, in Taiwan, over labor violations. That was on November 8th. Just already in beginning of September, we actually had that issue in our system. So it's really early warning. And this is what we're all about. We're looking at some of the small outlets, the NGOs, the regional government report in the local language. And sometimes we detect issues already there that maybe take 1 or 2 weeks to then swap over into the English mainstream reporting medium. My last slide here, I'd like to just give a brief forward view. We're in process of extending our incident coverage, not only in terms of sector or the country location, but we're mapping this sometime this year. We will roll this out really to the specific location in terms of geodata on our Earth. And once we have that done, we can then start overlaying that with additional data like the footprint of a mine, for instance, and how is the footprint in terms of deforestation around the mine growing. And that I think will be a very valuable tool to really estimate the real impact of these kind of sort of violating operations. And with that, I would pass back to Alok, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Heiko. That's very insightful to understand how RepRisk identifies, basically risk from different sources and how it alerts different companies. And of course, it also provides data for various purposes, either to investment funds or to even academics. So from there, I have got just one thing to mention. We have got 5 more minutes to talk about future research issues by Professor Manoj Tiwari, but keep your thoughts coming on the chat box and we will observe the questions. So if you have any questions for the panel, please share with us, and after 5 minutes, we will start raising these questions with the panel. So please keep your questions in the chat box, and I can see that Tony is very active in the chat box, responding to questions to number of our participants. So I'm from here. I would like to pass on to Professor Manoj Tiwari, who is also director of National Institute of Industrial Engineering. Many of who don't know about this particular university, this is a very specialized university in India on operations and supply chain management and industrial engineering. Professor Tiwari is director of this university, but previous to that, he was also a professor at India's most prestigious university called Indian Institute of Technology. And his research specifically focused on supply chain management, manufacturing systems, supply networks, and specifically focused on more in the last decade or so on environmental sustainability. He has research interests supported by several funding bodies from across the world. He has published more than 320 papers with Google Scholar Index of 66 and more. He has been ranked #1 among top 100 individual researcher who has published in journals such as IJPR, International Journal of Production Research. But he's also a recipient of the most influential research award in the domain of operations and supply chain management. So from there, I would pass on to Prasad Tiwari, who will just unpack what is the current status of research and what are some of the future research questions.
So thank you, Alok. Really, I'm very much, you can say, obliged to see in such a galaxy of speakers who are working in the domain of sustainability and sustainability related risk, which is very important topic nowadays. And its impact, I will tell that how much is there. That I can tell you from some of the reports which are visually available at many places. So as you can see that it's a multi-dimensional concept where we have many streams. They are playing a role in determining the risk which are associated with the supply sustainability risk. And say, for example, as you can see from the slides, like say developing the concepts and frameworks for managing the sustainability risk. And you can see that there are very less amount of research has been done, particularly empirical in nature, to connect the many factors which are playing a role, particularly environmental, social, or governance related risk and financial measures to capture some of the insights about it. And then as you can see that there is a increased focus one can witness on the supply related sustainability risk, and there are many factors which are influencing this risk, particularly when we say that how it causes and you can say remain of scaring in nature in days to come up. So next, actually, if you see the idea that we have about sustainability risk mitigation strategies. So basically, we have to talk about, say, how to avoid, go for the avoidance, monitor, collaborate, and accept it. So here you have to see that the different strategic antecedents which are connected with the sustainability risk. You can say they are supplier network structure, then procurement process and contracts, then the management factors and many policies of the companies. They are actually one of the key factors also that plays a role. And then when you come to monitoring of this, then certainly you have to look into account the environment, social and governance factors. And the moment you see the sustainability risk, then there are different risks which are connected with the water, climate, and you can say all the modern IT gadgets also. They are one of the key factors that are also affecting the sustainability risk. And then coming to the performance, then you have to have certain mandatory disclosures that need to be followed for effective implementation, like say ESG disclosures, stakeholder orientation, and stakeholders influence capacity. So then only we will be able to pinpoint the performance of the firms with regard to sustainability risk assessment. So next, actually, if you go, then we can see that there are many mathematical and empirical models. They are available now, particularly as you see that AI and ML, they are playing a big role, but along with that, many cooperative models that need to be addressed through the game theory. There are several optimization models where both, you can say, impact of the different measures that we take, they need to be maximized along with the minimization of the ongoing cost-related things. And there are many criteria which are playing a role. So therefore, many MCDM tools are also being used to capture some aspects of the sustainability risk. And of course, mathematical models which are dealing with quantifying the risk, they are already there. So one such study, which just I like to mention, this very clearly mentioned that you can see the importance of this. Like a report which is available in 2018, it suggests that the socially responsible investment assets totally accounted for around $12 trillion, and this is according to a 2018 biennial report on U.S. sustainable, responsible, and impact investment trends. And this report says that investment assets accounted for 12 trillion out of 47 trillion dollar in total assets under professional management in the US in 2018, and this shows a sharp increase of somewhere around 38% since 2016. And the kind of many AI ML tools they are using, particularly I can guess there are some papers which are being now talked, they are saying how the deep learning and deep technologies along with the many other algorithms they can be used to have a decision making and the optimization of the socially responsible investments and portfolio, particularly in finance, and then many supplier selection process, and also engaging with the other stakeholders, but keeping in total eye on how we can have this sustainability risk in mind. So with this, I can say that really it's very interesting to be with such a illustrious people who are devoting a lot of time in doing this timely research on such an important topic. And this forum of supply chain sustainability and workshop organized by this school, particularly led by Alok and his team, I say that it's a very timely event, and my all best wishes are there to move further in this direction. And Niti is very keen to be one of the key partner of this group in expanding the research that that the group can plan to carry out in days to come. Thank you, Alok, from my side. Now you can move to next.
Thank you very much, Satyavari. So thank you very much. You have very nicely presented the existing stream of research into 4 different categories, and highlighting the multidimensional concept, moving on to, looking at what could be the antecedents and how it could actually impact per performance, looking at some of the mediating and moderating factors, maybe ESG disclosure or stakeholder orientation, looking at why there is a need to look at emerging risk, for example, water scarcity, climate related, or modern slavery. And again, as you have highlighted, there are really dearth of research, particularly around analytical models for sustainability. And the reason for that is because it's difficult to quantify such risk. So thank you very much for that. From there, we move on to the discussion, and we have a number of questions for the panel. And I will start with Professor Robert Clausen, where we have the first question coming up from Amanda, which is talking about how do you think, Professor Clausen, is that R&D intensity is linked with, and that is one of your major of product long-term orientation. How is that linked with sustainability risk? What is the connection between these two?
Well, in large part, if you think about the first of all, thank you for the question. I think it's very important to sort of unpack and each of these variables, and if we had more time, I'd try to do it in more detail. But to try to address the question, in terms of thinking about product R&D, it's really about a lot of firms investing in trying to, first of all, there's the whole segment of product development focused on greener, more socially sustainable products. So in essence, how are you designing your product to be either potentially more energy efficient, ideally reducing its carbon footprint? Could include a whole range of different aspects in terms of consumer safety or the way it's assembled as well, just in terms of redesigning components, redesigning parts. Could include even some of the new e-vehicles that you're seeing finally hit the marketplace. All of these really have strong environmental implications that also, as an offshoot of that, lower the associated sustainability risk. You can think about a company as an extreme example, without naming any names, that focuses only on electric vehicles. Clearly, their risks around carbon footprint, carbon disclosure is quite different than the risks around somebody from a traditional auto manufacturer. And so the efforts and the investments that go into product development can shape the profile quite differently among companies in terms of how they're doing that. Now, it doesn't guarantee that every dollar of R&D is necessarily going to lower the sustainability risk. And in fact, what our results are saying is on average, that's true, but certainly you could find anecdotal example at either end of the scale where it's either strongly linked or alternatively might not be linked nearly so much.
Professor Clausen, I think follow up on that, there's another question from Alan asking, well, the question is very long, so it will take me time, but cutting the long story short, how do you overcome reverse causality, or how do you take into account the unobservable factors and endogeneity related challenge in your fancy models? That's what he says. And which areas of ESG are most impacted by the increased R&D measures?
Okay, so two excellent questions. And certainly it is a problem always to think about endogeneity and is there reverse causality going on. The relatively basic answer that I'll offer at this point, although certainly I can go into more detail offline if that would be helpful, is to think about, first of all, the lagging among the variables. And so that doesn't necessarily take care of endogeneity, but at least takes care of looking at how the time dependency works between lagging the R&D investment versus the outcome, which is the, in this case, the sustainability risk measure that we were using. The other aspect that we've tried is instrumental variables. It's another econometrics approach. I'll actually suggest one of my co-authors, Nuri, is much more expert in that than I am. But in essence, what we're trying to do is look for other factors that allow us to separate out some of that. And so we looked at, for example, the location of headquarters and so on as instrumental variables. And again, the results held under a whole variety of different model specifications. And that was really part of what we're trying to do. The paper is nearing the end of its draft stage at this point, but we feel quite confident in our findings and certainly we'll be sending out for peer review as well.
Thank you very much, Rob. Well, I have got a question from Lisa for BT. How exactly BT is helping their suppliers improve their suppliers, and particularly those suppliers who could not cope with the requirements?
I think we take a very pragmatic approach. So there's lots of tools and techniques that we freely actually help them with. I mean, one example is reporting to CDP, as I said. That's a good way of reporting carbon. When it comes to things like modern slavery, our suppliers often struggle with due diligence with their supply chain. So in many cases, we've actually helped them, and shared our techniques with them. And in many cases, my colleague in China, she's actually been training our tier 1 suppliers on how to do effective supply chain audits. And equally, I mentioned about how we extend our renewable energy deal to all our suppliers, and so on. Plus, we've always been quite forthright and quite transparent about sharing our own sort of knowledge, and for instance, if you go to our sustainability site within BT, there is a link, to a circular economy toolkit, which we've had for many years, and it's free for any supplier to use. So yeah, there's a number of our only I guess limitation is a lack of resource. We don't have that many that we can go around.
Great, thank you very much, Tony. Well, I have got one more question, which is interesting question from Sally. She's asking which pillar of environmental, social, and governance has posed the most risk and is considered as the main priority for firms and stakeholders.
It's hard to pin down just one. I think the environment and and the ethical side are the most important ones for us.
Yeah, yeah, go on, Rob.
If I may
I would say I have to echo that particular position. I think it is unique to each firm, and certainly some industries are very environmentally intensive, and so hence the risks are much higher. But on the other hand, for an increasing number of industries, the social perspective seems to be becoming very dominant. I'm not sure if it's because we feel we've made progress on the environment and public attention, customer attention, and so on is now shifting more to the social side, where there are enormous gaps still to be managed and improved.
Heiko,
Thanks
you
for
have
the question, Durga.
Hi, I second Robert as well here. I think it depends a bit on the sector and industry. So you can see that like governance tends to be driving the bank sector more. The social maybe more influential tool that so reputational risk that one has to monitor when you look at maybe the retail sector, the clothing sector. So I think it really depends a bit on the industry, on the sector itself.
On that, I would like to add something which I just want to mention. You know, we have been doing some research in this area, and our finding kind of pretty much goes with what. We agree with what Rob and Heiko said, but also goes with what Tony had mentioned. So increasingly, you know, if you look at the incidents that's been happening in the firm, so we analyzed more than 2,000 events over the last 10 years, and looking at the cumulative abnormal return of the firm, you know, using event analysis. And what has been found is that increasingly environmental and social related events impact firm more than the governance related event. But it's not that's the only complexity. You know, firm may have event within their operation, but also in their supply chain. And the finding also suggests that the supply chain related event hurt a firm more than its own operational related events, negative events. But it's not only that, also looking at, you know, if you have a track record, if you have a not a track record. So if you have a not a track record, then perhaps a stakeholder may give you some level of what you call as advantage. So for non-novel events, its impact firm a lot more in comparison to a novel event. So there's quite a lot of interesting research happening in that direction, and hopefully that answers your question. So I've got another question coming from, I think my chat box has gone a little bit. If I can bring in. So a question to Tony, do you think sustainability has a cost? And if yes, how does your company compete in a cost competitive environment?
I think quite the opposite, actually. I look at it really simply. The cost, say, of a product that a supplier is giving you is made up of 4 components. It's always those 4. It's materials, labor, overhead, and profit. And now, if you, for instance, if you start using renewable energy, for instance, or go to renewable sources of energy, look at your own heating and cooling systems and all that, and move to more sustainable means, yeah, there may be an initial investment, but your long-term, your overhead costs will certainly come down. Similarly, if you do something radical with your material costs by using techniques such as the circular economy, again, you might have to invest in a consultant to help you with that, but certainly that can have a step change in your cost reduction for your material cost. And so over the long term, sustainability is certainly profitable, and that's what we've seen from our supply chain.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tony. I have got a question for Heiko. I mean, this is a very interesting question that your organization analyze and rank other organizations based on AI tools. What do you think about sabotaging any company, flooding net world with fake information? How do you scrutinize the fake information?
I mean, the main tool for us to be safe is we have to use reputational data sources or data sources with good reputation. And we are not immune for if an article is researched and it is presented to us in our AI engine and it's from a good source, we report it also as such. And there are cases like you have a Lion Air crash that the information is not well known, which is not exactly the aspect that you're taking here, but that's one example. And we will link that to Lion Air at this point and not at Boeing. And so once information emerges, we also don't go back in 6 months in time and correct that. We're really reporting what we're seeing at the time from reputational sources. So in the case you have AI pushing through some Reddit forum, we will not be taking that information in, for instance.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Heiko. I think we are just closing to the time now, and I really want to thank you, all of you. There are still some questions, and I will try to compile some of these questions and try to circulate among you. Given the interest of time, we will have to close our session today. But I thank all the participants from across the globe joining us, and a special thanks to all the participants, all the speakers, particularly Professor Robert Klassen, Professor Tiwari, Professor Dr. Tony, and Dr. Heiko Beller. So thank you very much for all your insightful session today. And I'm sure there will be opportunities to answer some of these questions. So after this session, of course, we will circulate some of your slides, and the recording will also be available on YouTube. So thank you very much for your session today.